Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
The story.
When you're living through it, you're just getting through each day, one day at a time. You're not really seeing the bigger picture. You're concentrating on getting through. So initially, we didn't know that Samuel had Down syndrome before he was born, so it was a shock, and we never regretted the fact that we hadn't known.
G'day, I'm Jimmy Colefax. Welcome to The Story. Well, today our guest is journalist Morag Zwartz, who has written a book about her son called Being Sam. She describes it as a memoir of life and death, rascal chromosomes, rogue cancer cells, and a lot of love in between. She's going to unpack just what all of that means during the course of today's conversation, and she'll also share how God helped her in her journey of being a mother to a child with very serious health challenges. Morag Zwartz is having a chat with Eric Scatterbo.
Morag Zwartz, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you with us. And yes, we're going to have to start off by unpacking that description of your book with rascal chromosomes and rogue cancer cells. What's that all about?
Oh, well, the chromosomes is a reference to the fact that Samuel was born with Down syndrome, which is a chromosomal abnormality, number 21, chromosome number 21. And the rascal cancer cells is a reference to the cancer which Sam first was diagnosed with when he was 2, and that took his life ultimately.
Wow. So that's a lot for a parent to have to handle. I mean, Down syndrome is a challenge, of course, all its own, but then cancer on top of that. Quite a difficult journey that you and your husband went through.
Yes, although when you're looking back over something, it always looks slightly perhaps worse. When you're living through it, you're just getting through each day, one day at a time. You're not really seeing the bigger picture. You're concentrating on getting through. So initially, we didn't know that Samuel had Down syndrome before he was born, so it was a shock, and we never regretted the fact that we hadn't known. I mean, a lot of people want to know those sorts of things beforehand. They think they want to prepare, but I certainly was grateful that I didn't know.
Why is that?
I think I would have found it harder to get through the birth, quite honestly. Just getting through the birth was a big deal. And you know, at the end of a birth, a child with Down syndrome is just as beautiful, smells the same, has the same gorgeous smell and the same exquisite things that a newborn baby has. Mm-hmm. And so it's good that that's your first response. Your first response is, here's a beautiful baby, here's a gift from God. So, yeah, I found that a real blessing that it happened that way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now let's back up a little bit and find out about your story and your husband. You're both Christian?
Yes, we were both believers, and that's probably why we didn't go for any of the screening that we might have gone for, which then in 94 was available. I was offered an abortion actually the same time as I was told that I was pregnant. I think anyone 38 years old and older was... that was the sort of view of the medical, a lot of doctors anyway. And so we didn't have the further testing that you could have. I think that's probably because there was no question that we would have been doing anything other than hanging on to the baby.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that's because of your Christian faith?
Because of our faith, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
So your son Sam was born in 1994? Yes,
that's right. And number 6 in the family. So
your 6th child?
Yeah, so he wasn't the firstborn, which probably also made it a little bit easier. I think you've got a bit of confidence probably after a few children, and I think it would have been more devastating. I mean, I thought in these terms from the very beginning that always there's something that could be worse. You know, I think it would have been harder for a first-time mother to have a child with a disability. And then very quickly I came to think there are so many worse things that you could have a child born with. And also with disabilities or chromosomal abnormalities, the most common one by far is Down syndrome, trisomy 21. And so we already, again, I'm seeing it as this is a blessing. You know, it would be much harder to have a rare chromosomal abnormality and also one that's not so visible. Down syndrome is very visible. And so throughout Samuel's life, I was aware of the advantage of having if you've got a child who's talking to himself loudly in public, it helps if he looks different. That alleviates people's concerns very quickly.
I had never thought about that because people would look at Sam and know he has Down syndrome.
Yeah. When he was behaving strangely or uninhibitedly, let's say, when he was behaving, it was immediately okay. It was like, people would just smile. They get it. And
kind of to be expected.
Yeah, or acceptable. Just rather sweet rather than what's going on here,
Why isn't this child
behaving? You're a bad parent. Yeah, that's right. So, yeah.
Interesting. So, how did you react when you first found out that your newborn child had Down syndrome?
It's hard to remember those very, very early feelings, except that it was a huge shock, and none of us had much experience with anyone, well, not in our immediate families or anything like that, with any sort of disability. So it was a massive learning curve. But we were very blessed in as much as this is the biggest crowd out there, the Down Syndrome Association all over, most Western countries. And they made it easy for us. They came around, they offered us immediate support, and you quickly realise that you're part of a fairly big tribe. And, it took adjustment. It was a shock, but you're very quickly subsumed in the daily chores of survival and, in Sam's case, of getting enough food into him because he didn't feed very well. So those things just very quickly smooth out into a way of getting through. And we didn't have the sort of shock that involved despair or anger or why me or any of those sorts of feelings. We didn't have any of those. I think we just trusted that this child, like our other children and like all children, was a gift from God, and if God had chosen to give us this particular child, then that was his prerogative, and it was fine. Didn't make it easy, though.
No, but you did eventually kind of get used to your new normal.
Yes, and I say in the book, there's one point where I realised in quite a profound way that I had ceased to grieve for the person that he wasn't, and he had just morphed into not the minus person. He just morphed into himself, like any other child, and that's a strange transformation that takes place, and I think it takes place with any child who's born with any sort of disability or unusual situation, because they acquire their own normality in that home and in that family. He ceased to be, as I say, this minus person, and he just became Sam, and sort of perfect in his being Sam.
In his own unique way.
Yes.
But then, as soon as you kind of started to get used to this new normal, this situation of having a child with Down syndrome, then another development came.
Something else came along and crashed into us. Yes, he was diagnosed when he was 2, close to 3, with ALL, which is acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And for the rest of Samuel's life, that probably became a bigger feature than the trisomy 21, because that really is something you can't avoid or get around or deny or pretend. You're going to die, you're going to have horrible treatment, or you're going to die, or both, in our case. So that's cancer is much more in your face than Down syndrome, put it that way.
So at that point, it would be understandable if you started to question God. Why me? Why is this happening to us?
Yes, I wish I could remember more about how I felt. All I can say for certain is that I didn't ever feel like that, and I've never felt like that in life, because the way I was brought up, my mother was always very conscious of our blessings and our good fortune to be, born in countries where we would never go without and had opportunities and so on. And I always had a strong awareness of the fact that we were actually in a minority globally. We were always in a minority in the fact that we would have food and clothing and shelter. I didn't have an expectation that everything should be perfect and I should never have any, or we should never have any unexpected adversities, I guess. But not that you're thinking in this sort of rational way. It was just that was the subconscious position that I had. And so Why, if you could say, why me when your child has cancer, well, you could equally say, why not me? Because I would think, well, why not? Why should it always be someone else? Eventually that someone else is me. But I should also say, of course, that that's hugely impacted by my faith, and the faith is very much a part of that. This is God's world. God gives life and he takes life, and his timing is perfect. And he does as he chooses, and he does as he pleases. And he doesn't owe me an explanation for every little thing. That's a very, very, I feel that very strongly. God doesn't owe me an explanation. One day there are many things that we will understand that we don't understand now, but I don't feel that I need to have, there needs to be a justification for why my child should suffer from cancer and why my child should die.
So expect adversities in life.
Yes, well, you're living in dreamland if you don't, I think.
You're listening to The Story. Today, Eric Scatterbo is chatting with Morag Zwartz, who's written a book about her son called Being Sam. As we've been hearing, Sam was born with Down syndrome in 1994, and then a few years later was diagnosed with leukemia. We'll hear more of Sam's story and more of Morag's experiences when we return.
If this program has highlighted something you'd like prayer for, we'd love to pray for you. Call 1-800-PRAY-FOR-ME. That's 1-800-772-936. It's a free call. Or text 0401 132 888.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Colefax, and this is The Story. Today, Eric Scatterbo is chatting with Morag Zwartz, who's written a book about her son called Being Sam. As we heard before the break, Sam was born with Down syndrome in 1994, and then a few years later was diagnosed with leukemia. Next, Morag will share what it was like after Sam was diagnosed with cancer.
We started on what was the current treatment protocol at that time in 96, which was between 2 and 3 years of chemotherapy, and it was pretty hideous. And somehow we got through that period and life resumed a sort of normality, and Samuel became really well and bouncy and cheerful and full of life, and then out of nowhere he relapsed, and that was a huge shock. In fact, it was almost worse than the initial diagnosis, I think. And so we had more treatment, another couple of years of treatment of chemotherapy, and again life resumed some sort of normality, and Sam went, was bouncing around again, and suddenly another diagnosis crashed into us. And I have to say, at this point, it's extremely unusual that this should happen, because acute lymphoblastic leukemia is the most common childhood cancer, and a very high 90% of children have a round of chemotherapy and recover, and that's the end. Goodbye, cancer.
So you thought he was going to have a full recovery?
Well, he did, except that he then relapsed, and that's where it's very unusual.
Oh, that's got to be very hard emotionally, because you think you're past this, it's done, It's over with.
Yeah, I think I say in the book that one round of chemotherapy is like, oh, okay, well, that's not good. But the second round was like, whoa, this is more challenging. And then the third and the fourth and the fifth. So by this stage, we were like freakishly unusual. His oncologist at Monash Medical Centre said that Samuel was his longest standing patient. And it's certainly extremely rare for a child to have this sort of constant relapsing experience with cancer. And ultimately, towards the end of that 15 years of treatment, relapse, Samuel's cancer appeared additionally to the bone marrow, which is where leukemia, it's a bone marrow cancer. Mm-hmm. Then it appeared also in his spinal fluid, and that's now getting pretty serious. So now we were fighting the cancer on two fronts. And at that point, for the first time, his oncologist started talking about radiation therapy. And there are some children who have radiation therapy if their leukemia is a particular kind, but we hadn't had that, and I'd always felt that that was just like completely and utterly the worst thing imaginable, and we would never ever contemplate that. But towards the end of Samuel's life, we did have radiation for the spine and the cerebral fluid, so the brain and the spine.
I'm just wondering, what was Sam's attitude? How was he taking all this?
Well, here's one of the wonderful things about Samuel, and an enormous, incalculable blessing, and that was that because of his mental capacity was less than a normal person, he had no sense of impending treatment. He didn't know the word dread. He didn't anticipate, and so he was wonderfully spared those things that you and I would be experiencing if we were going through this. I mean, I would be dreading for days a certain thing, and I would be just horrified at watching some of the stuff, watching the infusions of ghastly looking stuff going into his veins, and so much stuff like that he was spared. He was spared. He lived utterly in the moment, and I thought this was a wonderful kind of lesson always to me. I sought to be like him. I sought to live in the moment like he did, and I saw him as a great leader in that regard, and I sought to follow him, and to have his take on life, and only sort of carry on and get upset and distressed the moment when we were walking in the treatment room, or the moment when he was about to go under in theatre under anaesthetic. So in that moment he would react, but until that moment he was wonderfully in his own zone. Yeah.
Wow. And then unfortunately his short life came to an end.
Yes. What seems always to have been inevitable did actually happen. And yet the strange thing about Sam's life was that because his habit became to bounce back, and his wonderful oncologist always seemed to have another cocktail that would keep him going, it became harder. Ironically, it became harder to believe that Samuel would die than it became easier. And yet, as I say, there's such a paradox here, it was more likely each relapse, and yet it felt less likely because his habit is to keep coming back. So there was a strange dynamic towards the end, those last months. But when the cancer came in the spinal fluid, as the CNS disease that's called, as well as in the bone marrow, we're like, whoa, how long can we keep this fight up for? And I was always terrified. I was convinced I would lose my mind if and when Samuel actually died. I just couldn't fathom what this would involve, and how one would live through this. And I was terrified because not that many years ago, people bled to death from leukemia, not that many decades ago. And so I would say to his oncologist, sort of like seek reassurance about this. And in the end, what happened was that Samuel died of septicemia, so he became sicker, and his body was folding up. And
how old was he?
He was 17 and a half, and he died at home, and we were all around him. The family was around him, and he became sleepy with the help of various medications to help him, because there was a lot of pain by this stage as well. And so he faded from us gradually, and in the end, I think probably I couldn't have asked for a more gentle decline and death, but there's still a gulf, an absolute gulf between being even just barely alive and not being alive at all.
Yeah.
You cannot fathom that until you actually are with it in that moment, and it's the biggest thing that you'll ever encounter. I think the hugest thing you'll ever encounter is to be with someone when they die. And one of the things that he absolutely loved, and that we shared a lot, Samuel and I particularly, was because we spent a lot of time in my car going to hospital and coming home and so on. And I had a CD of old hymns, one of which is involved the young Samuel, and he would always pick up his name and had absolutely loved that hymn. But he loved all of the hymns, and I really do think that they fed him in some way, these wonderful things about God. And I would talk to him about God, of course, all the time, and talk to him about heaven and being with Jesus. And I do think that in ways that may not be as obvious to us, he did have a sense of God and his presence. Yeah.
And then finally, looking back on all of your experiences, what can we learn from your experiences of being Sam's mother?
I think, I don't know about, well, to me what I would say, or that I learned, is God is sovereign, and that is the most comforting and wonderful thing. That those few words to me became, and still are, the most wonderful, comforting, secure groundwork for life. Because that means if God is sovereign, he is sovereign in every tiny atom, particle, the smallest thing, time and atom you can ever measure. And he owns and runs and controls and governs every single thing, right down to the tiniest thing. And that means when you really try and get your head around that, that means you see in stark contrast your own puniness and in your ability to understand anything really very much. And then so you easily give yourself to this wonderful, glorious, sovereign God who not only is sovereign and runs everything perfectly and beautifully and wonderfully, he's all good and all loving and all merciful. And the combination of that hugeness of his power and his control and his love, the hugeness of that is something you can just throw yourself into and rest in and nestle into and be comforted by. It's like, I don't need to understand anything that happened in Samuel's life. It was a life of terrible suffering, but also great joy. But it was one in which God had his purpose. And if I look back over that period, I would say, yes, God is sovereign, and he will carry you through whatever he brings in your life. If he brings this thing into your life, whatever the suffering or hardship may be, he will also be there to carry you through it. And I guess one final point I would say is that I feel very... was a very important discovery for me, and that is to not look forward but to look back. And that sounds funny, really, but
yeah, I always thought it was the reverse of that.
Yes, well, see, if you look forward, it's terrifying. That's my experience. It's terrifying. Samuel's going to die. How's he going to die? Which time is it?
Sense,
But all of us, I feel like that about myself as well. I find the future terrifying. But if I look back, I see, yes, God was holding us, God was carrying us, he got us through that day, he's got us through every single moment, every single day, every single week, month, year, until now. And so, wow, what am I worrying about tomorrow and the next year and whatever for? Because God has been carrying us and he has brought us. We're living evidence. Each one of us is proof that God has carried us thus far. And so that's my inspiration and the thing that I try and keep telling myself, yes, because the future is frightening, and it's frightening when you've lost a child, because there are days when you don't know how you're going to get through the grief, and there are days when the grief just consumes you. But again, you say, well, God has brought me thus far, he will take me through today.
Well, Morag, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric.
That was Eric Scatterbo chatting with journalist Morag Zwartz, who's written a book about her son called Being Sam. And as we heard at the beginning of today's program, that Morag described the book as a memoir of life and death, rascal chromosomes, rogue cancer cells, and a lot of love in between. And now, after hearing Sam's story, it becomes a bit more clear what she was referring to. Rascal chromosomes being Down syndrome, rogue cancer cells referring to leukemia. And as we heard, Morag shared, there was a lot of love in between. Also, the Lord helped her along a very difficult journey. The verse that comes to mind is from Psalm chapter 23. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. For more information about Morag's book, the website is beingsam.net. That's beingsam.net. Well, thanks for joining us for Sam's story. I'm Jimmy Colefax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.